NATO has formally announced the suspension of a key Cold War-era security treaty, this after Russia's withdrawal from this deal. NATO suspended this treaty because Russia did not abide by the rules of this deal. The NATO member countries who signed the treaty froze their participation in the pact after the suspension of this deal. The Russian Foreign Ministry has pulled out from the treaty on November 7th and blamed the United States and its Western allies for its exit. And Moscow has stated that the NATO members have demonstrated, quote-unquote, an inability to negotiate, making any agreement with them impossible. Now, it's important to note that this treaty is one of the several major arms control treaties involving Russia and the United States that has now been crippled in recent years. Russia suspended its participation in the treaty in 2007 and stopped actively sharing data about the troop movements with NATO. Now, remember, all of this is happening when Russia is already fighting its war in Ukraine. The Treaty of Conventional Armed Forces in Europe prevents Cold War rivals from amassing forces at or near their mutual borders. The other important question that now arises is, what will this mean for Europe? This treaty was signed in November 1990, but not fully ratified until 2 years later. Let's try and get in a sense of perspective, and for that, let me also introduce my guest today. I'm joined in by George Beebe, who's the Director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute, also the former CIA Russia Analysis Chief. Many thanks to you, George, for joining in here on CNN News 18. Now, Russia has suspended its participation in this treaty in 2007 as well, and in 2023, it in fact exited the deal. What is the sudden urge for Russia's exit? Is Russia planning a bigger offensive?
Well, I think this wasn't actually a sudden exit. This has been in the works for, in fact, several decades. When the original CFE treaty was signed in 1990, it provided for balanced limits on the forces that NATO and the Warsaw Pact could each hold. These were group limits for each of those alliances. Not very long after that treaty came into force, the Warsaw Pact broke up. And so the basis for having a balance between NATO and Russia's military alliance disappeared. So what had to happen at that point was they had to negotiate a new basis for conventional arms control in Europe. They adapted that CFE treaty to provide for national limits rather than group limits. That negotiation was successful, but that new adaptation of the CFE treaty was never ratified. The Russians ratified it. The United States did not. And as a result, we've been in a situation for many years where the Russians have been arguing for the West to take steps to make those national limits viable, and that has never happened. And now I think both sides are acknowledging that reality. We are essentially in a state of war, a proxy war from America's perspective over Ukraine. And arms control under those circumstances, conventional arms control, is pretty much impossible. So we're in a situation right now where yet another fundamental arms control treaty that helps keep the Cold War cold has now disappeared, and the prospects for its replacement are quite dim in the near term.
I think you very well explained the timing and its impact. Now, this treaty, since we all know, prevents Cold War rivals from amassing forces at or near their mutual borders. But now that the treaty has been suspended, can quick offensives be launched in Europe like it was the case during the Cold War?
Well, I think when it comes to Russia's capability to mass forces and mount some sort of large surprise attack, the answer is really no. America's intelligence collection capabilities are quite formidable. It'd be very difficult for the Russians to mass a large invading force without American and Western intelligence agencies picking up on those changes. So in practical terms, this doesn't change that picture. What it does do is contribute to the loss of trust between Russia and the West more broadly. And that the habits of communication, data exchange, openness, transparency about military movements have been lost. So this means that it's going to be harder for us to find a new basis for peaceful coexistence, for managing our security competition in Europe, unless we find a way to negotiate some new understandings.
Then what explains Russia's exit, George? Because that's the other question that comes to mind, considering the treaty was one of a number of major arms control treaties involving Russia and the United States together. And that now has been crippled. And of course, since you rightly mentioned, it has been happening for over some years now. Do you think this is Russia's way of taking down the United States yet again?
Well, I think to some degree it is, yes. The Russians believe that they are in essentially a civilizational struggle with the West. They're attempting to revise the post-Cold War international order, which was American-dominated and NATO-centric when it came to Europe. The Russians never liked that arrangement. They wanted to be treated as a great power, a participant in European security, rather than the object of Europe's security preparations. And they wanted what they regarded as a much fairer set of rules and more equally applied set of rules for international relations. And they believed that the United States essentially not only made the rules, but decided how to enforce them and when to enforce them and when to exempt itself from those rules. So the Russians are really pushing back against that. The war in Ukraine and the suspension of these arms control treaties is a part of that. Ultimately, though, I think the Russians don't want simply to create chaos in the world. I don't think they simply want to tear down the post-Cold War international order. They want some new set of rules that they regard as more equitable. And I think that's an issue that the United States is going to have to address.
George, how do you see the ramifications of this playing out, especially on the borders of the NATO countries, considering there will be no stopping of amassing of these forces on their borders? What do you expect next?
Well, I think it's a very volatile situation. The levels of trust and communications between the Russians and their Western counterparts are at rock bottom levels. That means that we're in serious danger of inadvertent escalation, of incidents in which the two sides could find themselves directly in military confrontation, with very little means of managing those crises and making sure that they don't erupt into great power war. So I think this is a very volatile situation, something that we are going to have to address sooner or later, and hopefully that will be sooner.
Many thanks to you, George Rabe. It's been a pleasure to have you share your precious insights here on CNN News 18.